Welcome to Good Talk, New Lines Magazine's Instagram Live series of conversations, episode 10, a little milestone. And I'm so excited to be joined by Cal Flyn. She is an author of Islands of Abandonment, a beautifully written book, Nature Rebounding in the Post-Human Landscape. This is the US version. But Cal is an award-winning writer from the Highlands of Scotland. She writes literary nonfiction and long-form journalism. Her first book, Thicker Than Water, was about frontier violence in colonial Australia, and it was a Times Book of the Year. And her second book that we'll talk about today won several prizes. The latest one, Cal was recently announced as 2021 Sunday Times Young Writer of the Year. It's such a pleasure to host you, Cal. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. How are you today?
Thanks. I'm doing great. We're having some lovely weather here in the north of Scotland, not as hot as it is further south in the UK.
Right. I read an article just 30 minutes ago. London cannot take this heat. This is not normal. That kids are being sent back from school even because it's so hot. Anyway, you can tell us a little bit more about how it is there. But I want to, you start this book, Cal, by describing a visit to Inchkeith, if I pronounced that correctly. It's an island in the Firth of Forth, just 4 miles across the water from Edinburgh. And you describe it and its history and how it's kept falling into obscurity, as you say, in different periods, all the way to World War II, how at the time it was home to more than 1,000 soldiers, but then after the armistice, the island was abandoned once again. And you use that example to kind of tell us, as an introduction, to tell us what the book is about. And I was wondering if you could shortly offer our audience some introduction about what do you mean by abandoned places, as you say, and how did you or why did you decide to write a book about what happens in such places? How is nature rebounding there?
Sure. So I guess I'm interested in what I've come to call like post-human landscapes. So this is just any kind of man-made landscape. It might be post-industrial, it might be simply abandoned houses, it might be brownfield sites of kind. Often they're sites that are derelict, and I seem to kind of zero in on sites that have been abandoned for several decades. That seemed to me to be a sort of peak in not only in the sort of uncanny character of these places, the kind of haunting atmosphere that you find in them, but also in I suppose the ecological interest of these places as well, because the book is, as I describe it, sort of exploration of the psychology and the ecology of abandoned places. So I'm interested in both of those things, the way that nature sort of reclaims these spaces, but also the way that they make us feel as we walk through them. I guess I started in Inchkeith because it was an example. Well, it's a literal island of abandonment, and I talk about abandoned places both as literal islands but also metaphorical islands. So I started with a literal island, Inchkeith, and this was one that I could see actually from my window when I was living in Edinburgh, and I lived in the middle of the city, but there was this sort of island of wildness that my eyes just sort of flooped over every day. I didn't really pay any attention, and then it turns out that this tiny island is in the middle of a busy shipping channel, but it's quite an important seal colony. It's also very important for birds, for hybrid butterflies, and all of that is quite surprising when you first look at it. It looks derelict, it looks lifeless, it's sort of bits of old World War II infrastructure. And so actually you have to learn to look afresh at the world around you to be able to understand the value of these places. But I think it's a taste that in this very sort of post-human world that we're in now, it's a taste we have to develop in ourselves and understand a little bit more about how we can find and recognize ecological virility as opposed to the picturesque. These are not the same things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That term was, I remember that, and I wanted to ask you specifically because you tell us how we need to look at the land differently. So I'll get back to that because I think it's very interesting and important to really, as you say, look at something with different eyes, even if it's in front of you. And so you traveled for 2 years and to places that, as you say, have already, like the worst has already happened there in different contexts. And you offer stories of 12 locations around the world, each in its different geographical context and past history. Could you tell our audiences, just so they get a grasp of what kind of the worst has already happened situations have you covered? Or rather, how did you choose these? Because I was wondering, or I was like, she surely had more than 12. It was probably tough to limit yourself to just these 12, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess what was important to me was that each location, not only does it have an interesting story, but it offers some special insight into a phenomenon that that is sort of related to this idea of abandonment. So each of them, it's a story of a place, but then it's also a story of a bigger issue. So when I talk about places that the worst has happened, that is anything from contamination. So for example, I go to the Chernobyl exclusion zone to look at that interplay between the radioactive contamination there, but also the sort of the trade-off with the lack of disturbance that much of the site had for a long period of time, because we as people were scared to enter it. So we saw rebounding of, for example, wolf populations, bear populations, but then the negative impact of the constant sort of radioactive damage that's being done to the species inside. I also went to Plymouth, which is the capital of Montserrat, a small Caribbean island that has been sort of swept through by volcanic flows. But there really it was like a disaster movie to walk through the remains of that town. It has been evacuated now for a couple of decades, and the scale of that, the sort of ash that's flowed through the town, and then the outer suburbs, which are slightly raised up on hills, are all grown through with tropical greenery. It was really like moving through a sort of science fiction landscape. But I look at smaller places too, ones that are sort of case studies of particular phenomenon. So for example, I talk about the East Lothian Bings. These are a type of spoil heap outside of Edinburgh, again, where I was living at the time. These are, spoil heaps. They're full of little bits of gravel, but what's happened over time is that we see the process of ecological succession. So these completely sterile tips are sort of grown over by things like lichen and moss, and then they secure the gravel, and then over time we start to see other hardy ruderal plants coming in, so dandelions, birch trees, which start to root in and again secure the whole thing, and all sorts of plants that just blow in through the randomizing processes of things like seed rain. So yeah, I guess it was a real mix of stuff. Sometimes I started off with a place because I knew this place to have a very particularly poignant or sort of attention grabbing story, and other times with the sort of less poster child's places, it was more because I knew I wanted to talk about a particular issue, so I just needed to find somewhere that issue. So for example, I looked at an abandoned botanical garden in Tanzania in the cloud forests, East Usambara Mountains, and that was because I was really interested in this idea of novel ecosystems. It's quite a controversial area of science at the moment. That's to do with invasive species and how they might bed into habitats and ecosystems and make themselves at home, and perhaps even come to be useful or create new functioning landscapes. So there I went somewhere where it was almost notorious for the number of invasive species that had arrived there during the colonial era. But then over time, they have turned out to, some of these invasive trees have actually acted almost like a nursery to allow the native trees to come through. So I guess I'm just interested in these sort of almost like provocative ideas or things where it's not quite as is unfolding a little bit unexpectedly, perhaps sort of the law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, and really each episode and each case that you described was so different and unexpected and unique in its own way, and you cover, so that our audience knows, even like places after war, occupation, from Cyprus to the place in France, which was so interesting with the heavy metal. I don't know what the spoilers, I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it was truly interesting how each place had its own unique context and a new different thing, an idea, as you say. I do want to ask, before we continue our conversation about something that obviously you write about climate change throughout the book, and you specifically talk in detail about this catastrophic global change, as you say, as a result of human actions. And while reading the book, I was wondering, will she say something about it? And you end up exactly writing about what some of your friends have challenged you, as you say, after you would return from some of the trips, and they would say, but Cal, if you're focusing too much on the silver linings and the positive, are you, you know, undermining the disaster that's been unfolding? And you write it in the book, but I thought it was important to also tell to our audience now. What would you respond to your friends when they would say something like that, or to anybody from the readers and the audience who would say, well, if you're talking about nature rebounding, aren't you kind of undermining this damage that's been done to the environment?
Yeah, absolutely. Because this was a big issue, I guess, that I sort of threw back and forth with myself, which is that if you're writing an optimistic book about the environment today, is that a responsible thing to do? And I suppose the way that I came to think about it was that looking at sources of hope actually is an important thing for us to do. It's important for us to understand that all is not lost. Otherwise, what would be the point in doing anything at all? If we're so convinced that we're locked into a terrible decline, feedback loops and so on, then, you know, perhaps we give up hope. There's that concept of learned helplessness in psychology. And I think there's something similar in our response to climate change news sometimes, which is that we decide just to sort of shut off our brains to it, not pay attention to it. And actually, the more you look into it, the more you start seeing things like reasons to hope. You know, for example, I have a chapter on abandoned farmland in post-Soviet states. And, you know, like what I learned about the potential for carbon sinking on abandoned farmland, not only there, but all across the world, because this is happening on an enormous scale, is that actually enormous amounts of carbon is already being sucked down quite naturally without any input from us. And this is plays not only an important role in sort of combating climate change or ameliorating climate change, I think is a better way to put that, but also it's very important for things like biodiversity and so on, because these are much better for the environment, these sort of naturally regrowing forests, than planting trees entirely for carbon sinking reasons, because they're sort of they're interesting in terms of the number of species. They're sort of layered environments. There's a lot more going on than simply the trees, and a lot of carbon gets stored in the ground as well. So the important thing to do then is to talk about these reasons for hope and say, okay, we need to protect whatever's happening here. Here's a force for good. We have to allow this to happen. How do we make sure that this can happen? So that might be rethinking how we conceive of these naturally regrowing forests. Often we talk about them as being like degraded woodland and therefore less valuable, but actually every piece of degraded woodland left for long enough becomes incredibly important woodland. So it's like understanding the potential that a piece of land can have and therefore protecting it. Or it might be understanding that, sure, we sink a lot of carbon from the atmosphere into forests, but there's a limit to how much that can forgive. As well as allowing this to happen, we also have to stop emitting more carbon into the atmosphere. So then you start understanding that there are many planks in combating climate change. And so it's important to look at not only one of them, but understanding how they might all fit in together.
I think that idea of hope is so important, and we don't hear enough about it. And you yourself write in the book that you've noticed when considering climate change or talking about it, there are very often and most of the time extremes, right? Either it's almost like a denial, or in a completely different way, completely debilitating sense of everything is lost. And you offer both scholarly research and I think that that's something to keep emphasizing, precisely to give people some agency and some sense of, like you said, all is not lost. And because people are scared and people are afraid. And I know that because at New Lines, we've published many different essays on this topic relatedly from different contexts. And we recently had, an essay about climate change from Afghanistan, or an essay in which we've seen that researchers' number one fear from Syria to Afghanistan is not war and terrorism over there, but the coming shifts in nature itself. So these are important to cover, but also to inject this sense of hope, which I will do now thanks to your book and the information that you have provided for us. But you do write in the book about when you speak about these abandoned islands, lands, that they by definition, quote unquote, once belonged to someone. And so you write of that as a key plank of the story, and different dynamics, as you write about those that drive abandonment and those who remain. And I was wondering, could you tell our audience a little bit about this? Because, and does the example of Detroit and New Jersey fit into this in terms of that urban blight? And I thought that when I connected the two, that was one example, but you can tell us more about this idea of dynamics of leaving and staying and how that impacts each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the psychology is such an important element of abandonment because, well, sometimes places are abandoned because of disasters and there isn't much sort of decision making to do, but actually a lot of the time it is more of a social change. So you might see economic failure, or you might see simple sort of, yes, I don't know, sort of cultural change over time. So in Detroit, you know, it's the movement of industry outside of an industrial city, but also in the abandoned farmland, this is the movement of agricultural families into the city. We're seeing urbanization all over the world. So I see it as being sort of opposing forces. There's this great sense of draw to our place that we call home. And so, in some people, that means that even as the place is sort of coming down around them, they decide to stay and to reinvest in the same place. So whether that might be, for example, the families that decided to return to the Chernobyl exclusion zone after they had been evacuated, that came from a very powerful place of not recognizing the surroundings that they were put in. So that might be a high rise in Kyiv, but also just feeling this incredible draw and attachment to this place where they've been before, and deciding that actually it was worth the risk. And you see this in lots of places around the world. So in a place called Wittenoom in Western Australia, for example, this was an asbestos mining community, and there are huge sort of mine tailings all around the town. And so there's been a great risk of mesothelioma over the years. That town was evacuated after the government realized what was going on, but some people refused to move, and it's very similar reasons. You know, it's this sense of, well, maybe it's harmful, but it's not harmful right now, and home is very important. And so you see that to a slightly different degree in, for example, in Detroit, the people who are trying to improve their neighborhoods from the inside. So they might be setting up community gardens in the abandoned plots, or they might be you know, boarding up buildings like their neighbors and taking care of neighborhood buildings that have been abandoned, because they want to keep this sense of a living, breathing, comfortable community. And so I think that is very moving, that way that people become so bonded to a place, and how they will really leave as a last resort. You know, people don't want to leave home. The other thing I looked at in the New Jersey chapter when I went to Paterson, it was sort of the opposite side of this coin. It was why places being abandoned, new people might find them attractive, and abandoned places can have this sort of strange, almost perverse magnetism to them. You know, people find themselves drawn to these places because they make themselves feel free, that they feel somehow outside of the normal rules of society, that they can sort of express themselves or live a bit dangerously, or whatever it is that they want to do there. So you know, you find this a lot in teenagers. They're drawn to abandoned places. But I think that this is fairly universal, and that's what lies behind these sort of urban exploring communities of people who want to go into these ruinous places, take photos, but also just to sort of feel them. It's very similar in the way that I think about it to like wanting to go out into the wilderness or go out into nature. You know, it's a similar feeling that you feel quite sort of close to the edge in these places, and confronted not only by sort of scale, especially if you're in enormous broken down old buildings like factories or hospitals or something, but also this idea that you're confronted by the passage of time, and it makes you feel very small. And there's something very invigorating about these places because of that.
Yeah, and specifically if we speak about Detroit, I think it was very important to emphasize, as you write, how these anti-blight projects have a long and troubled history there. And in the case of Detroit, which you use as example, I thought it was so important to just understand how, as you described, this idea of modernist architecture, which was rooted in that idea that, as you write, if the environment was new, then the community living in it would become so too. But that's not the case, and not all communities. Actually, some communities, specifically African Americans in Detroit, suffered a lot from these anti-blight projects as well, right? And that is one more consequence of these stories. but all throughout, again, as you mentioned at the beginning, there is this idea of ecological virility that you had mentioned, and which I thought was very important in terms of looking at these ugly and worthless sites with new eyes. And you tell us that if we change the perspective of it, things would be much different, right? In terms of how we look at these lands as well.
Yeah, I think so. It's to do with what we value, and you know, the way that the conservation movement is constantly growing and changing and rethinking its philosophy. But a lot of the time, in the fairly recent past, things have been very interventionist. We often want to think, you know, like, what can we do to fix this? And sometimes that has backfired because perhaps what we've done to an environment has almost undone some natural processes of recovery, or we're like constantly keeping it in a state of disturbance, whereas things can sort of regrow and heal and things. So for example, these spoil heaps in near Edinburgh, they're a really good case study because there are some which were completely ignored, and there were some which in the 70s and 80s were sort of tackled by local conservation groups who wanted to make them look better. So they planted them with green, they fertilized them, they put new plants on them, all sorts of things to try and make them look a bit more natural, quote unquote. And actually over time, although in the short term it made them look better, over time the plants didn't really stand up. They needed constant reapplication of fertilizer. They needed essentially gardening to keep them looking nice. And the biodiversity of those sites is much, much lower than the ones that were simply left and ignored. That's quite an extreme example, but it is something that you can see sort of across many different projects in the past. And of course, people working in restoration ecology are constantly trying to change so that they're sort of assisting nature rather than overruling nature. But it is, I think it's a danger to be like constantly overreacting and trying to, you know, open the bonnet and fiddle with the workings, when actually there are so many species which are very self-interested in trying to fix things for their own interest all the time. So it's finding a balance between, I suppose, ignoring the problem and also over intervening where maybe it's not necessary, and it's might be very expensive and it might backfire.
Yeah, and finding that balance is so hard to do. I don't because there's so many forces and different news that we keep getting all the time. And so you mentioned hope a little bit, which then leads me to ask you about this aspect, this part of your book in which you talk about eschatology, and how it has been really, you say it often flourished during times of crisis. And then you tell us how a lot could be learned about a culture by studying its particular brands of apocalypse, which I thought was so fascinating, and how you describe that and then lead us to think about faith as well. So I was wondering, can you tell our audiences what have you found, at least in the West, as you write about these apocalypse and the coverage of this topic in that sense?
Sure, yeah. I mean, like two great themes sort of come out of that. I mean, like apocalyptic fiction has been big for a long time, and that's in sort of books, it's in, you know, literature, it's also in movies and television shows and all sorts of things. And I consume as much of this, possibly more than almost anyone else. So like I enjoy that, but it does give us a sort of strange insight into human psychology. Like, what do we find fascinatingly horrifying? And it comes again and again.
Psychology, right? By the way, just to say, you studied psychology, right?
Yes, yeah, I did, and so like I guess I'm always interested in it. I think you know, so like ideas of plagues, you know, this comes up again and again. Like lots of like zombie apocalypse movies are essentially plague movies, and so we're very interested in pandemics, and we always are. And at the moment, there's a real movement towards cli-fi, like climate fiction, so sort of visions of extreme futures. You know, it's really big. There are some wonderful books which sort of take our worst case scenarios and extrapolate it into the future and look at, you know, what human relationships will be like in that time. And I guess that it comes from this place of like uncertainty. We don't really know where the world is going, and we almost want to sort of imagine ourselves able to cope with it. You know, so many of these apocalypse narratives are are somehow heartwarming, or you know, like the people really rise to the challenge, that kind of thing. So I think it is, in a weird sense, these end of the world scenarios are sort of reassuring or comforting in some way. It's a bit like how crime fiction can be comforting too. So I think eschatology, particularly, you know, today we come back to those themes again and again, and those are the ones that as a society we really are struggling with. I mean, today and now and here.
Yeah, and I mean, you have spoken about this idea of balance throughout your book and our conversation, and just last few questions that I want to ask you. I mean, we've seen the headlines everywhere, particularly in the last few days, even more than usual, because of the things that have been happening with the wildfires across Europe lately, the deepening drought across the West here. Many activists and scholars who have been, at least here in the US, from what we see, experts, just really warning about how little or not enough US in particular has shown in terms of leadership, decreasing carbon emission, and how, well, one of the arguments is that US can convince China and India to do so, and by not showing leadership, the world in general is going to be a worse place in terms of climate change. I want to ask you, Cal, what would you advise these people? What is it that, if they were listening to you based on your research, how you tell us about if we only learn to let it do so? You write about this idea of forgiveness, but is the balance the idea that the audience should take out in terms of what you advocate the most, in terms of understanding these extremes? How is it, I guess, how has this book changed you? Are you an optimist by nature? How?
You know, I think in terms of the climate, I swing from extremes, to be honest. So like one day I'll feel complete despair and like there's nothing we can do, and then other days I feel like, well, maybe there's a chance, you know. And so I think writing this book from, I don't know, I think of it as an optimistic book, but then when I read it again, you know, like it's sown through with sort of doubt and apocalyptic writing as well. So I think it probably reflects quite well my feelings on this matter. And I think in terms of the US, what is frightening is that it's simply not discussed enough. Like, how can this not be the main the main discussion that's going on? You know, like so much else that's happening in the political debate is essentially a distraction from the enormous elephant in the room, and this is risking everyone. And you know, talking about Americans' influence on China and India, well particularly actually in China, there is a bit of a sea change in terms of their environmental outlook. That's not really helping with that's not really helped by the United States sort of actively kicking against environmental warnings all the time. I don't think it's a very helpful debate that's going on at the moment. This is also true in the UK, where, you know, about 10 years ago, actually, the sort of climate change and green issues were really actually at the forefront of discussions for a brief time, and then that was all derailed, and that again has sort of sunk into the background. But you know, the problem, if anything, is getting worse. It's not a bad time for us in the UK to be having a leadership debate, because with the incredible temperatures that we're seeing in the UK and across Europe as a whole, it's no longer an elephant in the room. It is like an unignorable presence that is breathing fire down our necks. So it's not a bad time for us to be having these discussions about the direction of the country. And I hope in the US as well, you know, you've got a lot of on your plate at the moment, you know, especially with women's rights, but this is something that can't be ignored, and it has to be discussed.
Mm-hmm. You tell us that this is not a book about, or that this should be a book about darkness, but it's a story of redemption, not restoration. And I wanted to ask you as the last question, do you have some stunningly unforgettable memories from one place in particular compared to others from these that you have described in the book?
Yes, I think, well, at least a couple. I mean, one of them must be walking through Montserrat, the incredible destruction that I saw at the hands of the volcano. And the other, I guess, would be actually being at Slab City near the Salton Sea. So this is a sort of anarchist community that's grown up on an abandoned military site near the Salton Sea. So this is an area of high desert, and it was a real sort of Mad Max place. It felt to me almost like a sort of, well, it felt like these apocalyptic narratives coming true. You know, I was surrounded by people building houses out of trash, literal trash, and sometimes building artworks as well and managing to make them beautiful, but really living at the edge of, you know, human existence, the possible margin for humans to live in. You know, the temperatures are extreme, and you have to be incredibly self-reliant to be able to make it in the desert during the middle of the summer. And I don't know, it was a strangely like scrappy, peppy kind of place. You know, it had its own spirit. People were sort of proud of making it there, but it did feel like a dystopian future that was already here. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about Slab City and that sort of lawless air, and that, yeah, the aesthetic of the post-apocalypse, which I really hope is not going to be the future for us all, and not just the people in Slab City who have, I guess, opted for it in some way.
Hey, Cal, thank you so much for writing this book. It's such a thought-provoking, informative, beautifully written book. I was looking at the covers of your UK and US edition. I don't know which one is prettier. They both have my favorite colors. The one in the UK is also very beautiful. I think, and I hope that the audiences will delve more in depth with this book. It's really important to keep discussing it, hopefully to give some hope, but to not give a free pass, as you say, to understand the catastrophe that's been going on. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining Good Talk, and everybody in the audience can follow you on social media when you're not in holiday or somewhere else, right? Are you working on something new in particular at the moment, or?
Sort of, yes. I'm working on a project which, again, it's I guess to do with how landscapes make us feel, and nature, and our relationship with the non-human. At this stage, it's a little bit unconfirmed, and it's just all in that vague little place, but hopefully I'll tie down pretty soon.
Great, fantastic. Everybody else, this conversation will be posted on our Instagram and YouTube channel, and on other social media platforms. Stay tuned for more good talks with people from all over the globe. I appreciate your time again, Cal, and everybody else. Have a nice day.